In watching the latest Showtime pay-per-view card, I was struck by how bland the broadcasting team was, and it got me thinking about how the current cancel culture, or call it political correctness, has even affected boxing broadcasts. And the Showtime team consists of a host in Brian Custer, two analysts in Al Bernstein and Abner Mares, a blow-by-blow commentator in Mauro Ranallo, an unofficial judge in Steve Farhood, and a roving interview reporter in Jim Gray. And all of these voices are somehow going to be heard over the course of a fight card. Now, having all of these microphones doesn't make the broadcast any more enjoyable or polished. It simply diffuses any kind of interesting point of view. Now, back in the day, we had Howard Cosell, love him or hate him. He would do all of these jobs by himself. And it got me thinking about who were the best broadcast crew or announcers that the sport has seen. Granted, this list will be obviously subjective, and my rankings may be biased by the time period I grew up in. I grew up on boxing in the 1980s. So my older listeners may have a Howard Cosell listed higher than I have and may chastise me for not including Don Dumphy. But I'm confident that my younger viewers will not have any such sentimentality toward the current crew of Showtime, DAZN, ESPN, or the PPC announcing teams. So this is a list made in fun, and there really isn't an objective criteria, just more of a thought experiment that I'd share. So I want to start with some honorable mentions because there are a couple of broadcasters that could have made the list, but because of circumstance or lack of longevity, they don't quite warrant a rating. The first is Randy Gordon. Now, Gordon had a short run on a few channels, notably the MSG and USA Network, and his knowledge of boxing history was impeccable, as he was the editor of Ring Magazine at its best in the early 1980s. He called fights with a lot of passion, and he knew his stuff. Now, the second is Scott Ledoux, whose brief tenure over at ESPN gave us a nice surprise. He had a way of describing the action like you were sitting next to a boxing expert at the neighborhood bar. He was the down-to-earth and had that gravelly voice, and he was a better commentator than he was a fighter. The last honorable mention is Paulie Malignaggi, who gave Showtime's broadcast a much-needed shot in the arm with his strong opinions and his breakdown of strategies that a fighter should be employing. But he was working for the wrong company. Showtime wants their brand to be bland. They want their employees politically correct 24/7, and he was fired for something that he said outside the corporate umbrella. So guys like him are simply not a good fit for the modern broadcasting companies, and that is a shame because he did the job quite well, and he made a broadcast worth watching. Number 10, Alex Wallau. Now, Alex Wallau would be paired with Jim Lampley and later Dan Deerdorf for the play-by-play, but Wallau was the brains behind the broadcast. He was a stellar analyst, and despite not having any first-hand experience in the sport, he knew all of its nuances backward and forward. He was a well-informed boxing expert who brought a lot of class to the broadcast, and he obviously knew how to call a fight. Unfortunately, he suffered from throat cancer, so his time behind the microphone looked to have been cut a bit short, as I remember him looking as if he were laboring to speak in some of his later broadcasts before he left the air. But he was a pro. Number 9, Ferdie Pacheco, Steve Albert, and Bobby Czyz. Now, the team of Pacheco, Albert, and Czyz, they were like the redheaded stepchild to their counterparts over at HBO during the 1990s. Steve Albert did bring an easygoing tone to the production, while Pacheco and Czyz were capable in their analysis. Some critics may claim they were shills for Don King at times, but it was actually fun to watch Pacheco's post-fight interview with Don King and then letting King go on some of his comical rants. I got a kick of how Don King would invent new words and try to sound intelligent by using words like obstreperous, and indubitably Bobby Czyz himself, he had the gift of gab, and his discussion of certain techniques were always well done. And like Malignaggi, he got fired for something he did outside the corporate office. But you get the impression that the company just needed an excuse to start with a new team and get rid of them. They were a capable trio, but they didn't have the same production budget as their HBO rivals. They did have a memorable fight, of course, with the Tyson Holyfield bite incident, and I thought they did a capable job with that situation. Number 8, Keith Jackson. Now, Keith Jackson was primarily known for being a college football announcer, but he knew his way around the ring. Like Cosell, he was able to do the entire broadcast by himself, and his good old boy delivery was a welcome addition to the sweet science. He didn't give us any whoa Nellies in boxing, but his call of the fourth Bobby Chacon Bazooka Lamone fight should be a must-watch for any aspiring broadcast journalist. He knew exactly when to vocalize his excitement and when to shut up and let the audience take in the battle of wills that was Chacon Limon 4. He also did a lot of Mark Breland's fights, and he had a very relaxed and likable vibe about him, but he was more in demand for college football and the other sports that he covered, but he did a really good job in boxing, I thought. Number 7, Sean O'Grady and Al Albert. Now, Tuesday night fights on the USA Network is sorely missed. They would broadcast fights from every nook and cranny in the country, the small town cards that are now overlooked or streaming. They spent a lot of time broadcasting out of the Blue Horizon in Philadelphia, which was a tiny arena that they made the fights seem more significant and bigger than sometimes they actually were. Al Albert was just like his brothers. He had a great radio voice and kept the flow of the broadcast smooth, while O'Grady did an adequate job in analyzing the fights. He could relate the goings-on to his own career, and Sean's blackboard, where he would break down the fighters' keys to victory, was always something to learn from and quite accurate. The two had great chemistry and had a lighthearted approach to the sport, which was always fun and time well spent to a fight fan. Number 6, Howard Cosell. Now, I was never a big fan of Cosell. He's definitely a love him or hate him type of personality, but he has to rank here because of his involvement and promotion of the careers of Muhammad Ali and Sugar Ray Leonard. He was able to make stars of those legendary fighters, and his own delivery was quite good. His voice and cadence were uniquely his own, and his calls of Foreman and Frazier and Foreman Lyle really added to the drama of the fight. You know, these are classic calls, and he had an innate ability to raise his voice to complement the drama of the fight. But on the flip side, he never really liked boxing, as evidenced by his behavior during the one-sided Larry Holmes-Tex Cobb fight where he quit announcing the sport. I think he made the mistake of thinking he was the show, and for that reason, I can't rate him higher because I got the impression he just looked down on the sport all along, and he was more focused on the making celebrities in the sport. So number 5, Ferdie Pacheco and Marv Albert. Now, back in the 1980s, if you were a boxing fan, your Saturday afternoons were spent with either Marv Albert and Ferdie Pacheco or Gil Clancy and Tim Ryan. Now, I rate the Pacheco and Albert team just a hair below, as I don't think their productions could afford them the higher-priced fighters of the era, but some of their fights were equally good. You know, Pacheco and Albert, they had the weekend warriors in Frank the Animal Fletcher, Curtis Parker, Mustafa Hamsho, and John the Beast Mugabe, among others. So we got to see a lot of middleweight action, while CBS could afford the bigger paychecks of Hector Macho Camacho and Ray Boom Boom Mancini. Marv Albert was the eldest of the Albert brothers and paved the way to their family's success in the business, while Pacheco, as mentioned earlier, he did have enough first-hand experience with Muhammad Ali as Muhammad Ali's doctor to give insightful commentary. He was a true Renaissance man. He was a doctor, a broadcaster, an author, and later quite an accomplished and a really good artist. He has some paintings up on eBay that you might want to check out. On the flip side, Pacheco could also babble a little bit. He loved using the word discombobulated, which he would use several times through the broadcast. And some of his gaffes were funny, and you'd think they would be coming from Marv Albert, who would do basketball games, but I remember hearing Pacheco calling Aaron Barkley Charles Barkley and Michael Olajide Elijahwan. But we can forgive him for that, as he was a mainstay of the sport for decades and obviously had a great passion for the fighters themselves. Now, number 4, Gil Clancy and Tim Ryan. Now, Ryan and Clancy definitely had great chemistry. Ryan had a professional, crisp-sounding voice, while Clancy was the everyman, that knowledgeable fight expert that you'd want sitting next to you on the bar stool watching the fights on the TV above. Now, Clancy had a way of breaking down the fight so that a layperson can understand what's happening. On the flip side, he did have a tendency to exaggerate and be redundant. I can't tell you how many times I've heard him describe a prospect as the best young fighter I've seen in years. And he always loved to talk about how a fighter should never blow their nose in every single broadcast. So he had his picadillos, but his delivery and chemistry with Tim Ryan made a lot of fights special. And like Teddy Atlas, he had an ability to get a good psychological read on a fighter. Like an example is when he called the Davey Moore-Gary Guyton fight back in the early 1980s. He could sense that Moore was losing, but it would be his desire that would pull him through. And his words proved to be prophetic in that one. So Gil Clancy was a great voice in boxing that's missed today. Number 3, Barry Tompkins, Larry Merchant, and Sugar Ray Leonard. Now, I read a boxing article back in the 1980s that described Barry Tompkins as being like an AM radio DJ. Now, I don't think it was interpreted as being written in a condescending way, but in a way that he had a mellow and positive vibe. He can be excitable when need be and was always classy and professional. Now, Sugar Ray was always a welcome addition ringside, as he was really one of the first fighters to accurately parallel his own experience in the ring with what was going on and talk about what a fighter needed to do to change things up when things weren't going their way. But most of all, the HBO broadcast benefited from the high-end production value. During this time, the HBO Sports president was a huge boxing fan, and they went all out with their pre-fight biographies and this allowed the viewer to get into the backstories of the fighter. So a lot of stars owe their success to being on HBO. Number 2, Jim Lampley, Larry Merchant, George Foreman, Roy Jones, and Emmanuel Stewart. Now again, in terms of production quality of a show, HBO couldn't be beat with the team of Jim Lampley and Larry Merchant and whichever guest analyst they had on, whether it be Foreman, Jones, or Stewart. They made even the most trivial fights seem like an event, and everything was filmed as if it had a cinematic feel, as if we were watching a movie unfold. Jim Lampley has to be considered the best play-by-play announcer of this time period. He knew when to get excited and when to ask questions of his analysts. His delivery was always authentic and exciting, and he obviously worked hard on his craft to become the best. Larry Merchant, he could rub people the wrong way. I remember some rude exchanges he had with Foreman and Sugar Ray Leonard, where he would just cut him off or just say something dismissive. But I respect him for not being a shill for some of the fighters that HBO was clearly trying to promote, like when they were trying to hype up Prince Nassim Hamed. And Merchant wasn't a big fan of Hamed, judging by his words. Merchant did get the shaft at the end of his career, which is a shame. I got the impression that he was given the boot simply because of his age, which is ridiculous, because he forgot more about boxing than his replacement would ever know. Merchant was the type of reporter where you can see him thinking aloud through his words as he talked. But to me, that was part of his appeal. He was authentic, and his opinions were well thought out, whether you agreed with him or not. Together, Lampley and Merchant elevated a lot of fights and made some of them seem a lot more significant than they really were. And when it came to the great fights, they rose to the occasion, just like the fighters did. The Ward Gotti trilogy comes to mind as an example. So a great broadcast team whose termination is a tremendous loss to the sport. Number 1, Teddy Atlas. So when analyzing these rankings from the bottom to the top, I used the following criteria: the production value of the broadcast, the likability and knowledge of the broadcasters, and above all else, I had to answer one question. If the fight of the year was on TV, which analyst would you like to hear more than anybody else? In my opinion, that analyst would be Teddy Atlas. Atlas is the number 1 professor of the sport. No one knows both the technical know-how of the fight game and the psychological nuances like Teddy Atlas. He has the ability to decode what a fighter is trying to do both physically and mentally, better than any broadcaster in the history of the sport. I've read online that a lot of people don't like the metaphors he comes up with sometimes, but I like them. It's like HBO gave a lot of their fights a cinematic feel. Atlas sometimes gave his fights a literary feel with some of the metaphors he came up with. So I see his style and even some of his sayings being imitated by certain broadcasters nowadays. But when it comes out of their mouths, it seems hollow. The ESPN broadcasts today are sorely missing his presence. But again, he's a bad fit for today's broadcast companies who, really only want shills with vanilla personalities. And their primary goal is not to entertain or inform. They only want broadcasters that won't offend. And with Atlas, you always got the truth as he saw it. And I learned something about boxing every time I watched a broadcast with Teddy Atlas. And he's really missed on live broadcasts. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Let me know what you think. Who is your personal favorite announcer or team? Please like or subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.